This week on the nonprofit news feed, well, we're back. We took a week off and we're back, and we have a whole bunch of news to cover, including some landmark Supreme Court meddling with colleges, affirmative action, student debt. And then we want to cover some of the recent news about the 2022 giving report that we actually sent out on the email last week. Nick, how's it going? You got some very yellow lighting right now. You're like banana mode.
I'm in the banana room right now. Very 90s yellow, which is not super flattering. So for the folks who watch this podcast, the super fans, I apologize, but I want to take us in right to our first story. And this is, of course, that last week, the Supreme Court delivered two landmark rulings on affirmative action and student loans. So these two rulings were quite significant. The first of which struck down affirmative action in college admissions, and the other rejected President Biden's plan to discharge federal student loan debt. So the affirmative action decision mandates colleges and universities seek alternate means to achieve diversity within student bodies beyond considering race outright, overturning essentially a precedent of 45 years. So in this 6-3 ruling along conservative liberal party lines, the ruling was written by Chief Justice John Roberts with concurring opinions by Thomas, and the dissents from Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, who argued that this decision rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. The ruling indicated that while students may write about how race has impacted their lives, institutions may not apply a regime that establishes a race-based preference for admissions, a verdict that has prompted some institutions to reassess their commitment to diversity. Many universities put out email statements saying that they would address diversity in other ways. Of course, this really is going to shake up college admissions. I'm sure universities have been preparing for this for a while. This decision was not surprising given the current makeup of the court, but one that will be impactful nonetheless. In a separate ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that President Biden's plan to forgive some or all student loan debt was unconstitutional, arguing that the administration exceeded its authority under law. This was also a 6-3 decision that means that the HEROES Act does not grant the Secretary of Education the ability to forgive essentially hundreds of billions of student loan debt. And the overall takeaway here, George, is that these nonprofit universities, many of them private nonprofits, as well as student loan borrowers, which is a high percentage of the public, has just experienced a huge policy shift coming from rulings from the court. Of course, with deep implications for higher education, both on the admissions and financial side of things. So, George, this is the court we're living with. It is a deeply conservative court, one of the most conservative courts in recent modern American legal history. And what do we make of this?
I mean, it's just too much to unpack for, frankly, my level of expertise in this. I think the second order effects are going to be interesting. That's always what I look for when you do something this, shockingly sweeping to the process of our educational institution. There are going to be some unintended consequences. I mean, we have watched as state by state absolute ridiculousness has happened post Roe v. Wade just a year ago. And so, initially one of the things I was watching was the fact that just on Monday, you had lawyers for civil rights, a nonprofit based in Boston. They filed a civil rights complaint on behalf of Black and Latino community groups, alleging that Harvard's admissions system violates the Civil Rights Act because of legacy, and how basically if you have legacy, you have a much higher chance of getting in. And if you write big checks, you have a much higher chance of getting in. So, how do you draw a line on affirmative action versus basically like wealthy action, right? Like wealthy kids, you get in. Like where and how you draw those lines matter quite a bit for diversity. So I'm very interested on how that, plays out. With regard to the student debt, it is it's incredibly complex. I think there were some of the arguments that, wait a minute, if you just do a blanket student debt forgiveness, doesn't that, kind of help indiscriminately people that maybe could pay it back themselves, and why we're doing it? Just some stats, you make up your own mind. Like 28,000 on average is owed per borrower. There's 1.7 trillion held in student debt. Mind you, you cannot get out of student debt by bankruptcy, right? That thing follows you to the grave. Yet you are expected to take on that level of debt before you understand what compound interest is. 55% of students from public four-year institutions had student loans, and 57% of students from private nonprofit four-year institutions took on educational debt. 92% of all of that debt, that 1.7, 92% is actually held, I believe, in federal student loans. So I think just the blanket halting of that really missed an opportunity to look at how you could have used student debt as an equalizer for supporting low-income Americans, actually. Done in the right way. I think there was a way to do it. Yeah, I disagree with both rulings, I'd say.
Yeah, George, no, I think that's a fair assessment. And I'll kind of respond to each of those because they're a little bit distinct. With regards to the affirmative action ruling, you highlighted that civil rights case on Monday. There have been other lawsuits. There have been lawsuits all over the place. Essentially, the Supreme Court, like they did with the Roe, the cat out of the bag, and now it's something of a legal free-for-all that is really going to upend college admissions and make things much more different. Listen, I'm not defending, I'm not a paid spokesperson for Harvard University, right? But, I don't care what they do. But I think in general, legal chaos is not good for anyone. And in this case, it's particularly not
good for the lawyers. They bill by the hour.
It's good for the lawyers. Good for the lawyers. But hey, nonprofit public interest attorneys, we hear you. We support you. Yeah, no, but George, that's exactly right. Like, ultimately, who's this going to impact? It's going to impact students. It's hard to see where colleges become more diverse after this rule and will likely become less diverse, right? It seemed that Roberts kind of put in some kind of get out cards where students can talk about race, but it can't be the sole factor. It has to be based on the individual experience. But in states where affirmative action has already been made legal at public colleges, diversity went down. So the second order effects of this will likely be measurable. So we will follow that closely. I'm sure there's bound to be significant more flurry of legal action. I'm not an attorney, but this is a case I've been following closely. It's something I care about. So we'll see where this goes. On the student loan thing, I agree with you. It was kind of controversial, just, kind of a blanket, 10,000 off everybody's balance. But as a borrower myself, I have to support it, right? I am a self-interested creature. Listen, we support it. I mean, we'll see what happens. But look, I think that there needs to be a fundamental conversation about what higher education in this country is, what it could be, and what it shouldn't be. And we are doing ourselves a disservice by having these kind of piecemeal conversations, right? Student loan one-off. Okay, great for people who have that debt now. But what about high school seniors who don't yet have that debt and are now facing tuition costs that are ungodly, unseemly? What are we doing?
Unacceptable, un-American, unpatriotic, unfathomable.
I mean, listen.
On a serious note, hold on. So you are a borrower. I'm kind of curious. Did you, it's like somebody playing with your bank account in a very, very weird way, right? You have this $10K of debt sitting on you and you're like, wait a minute, why would I make a single payment to this if there was a chance? And at one point I felt like you thought there would be a high chance of this, right? You and your friends. I don't know if it's a conversation that's youths today talking about their student debt. But how did that just personally play out between, you and recent college grads?
Yeah, no, George, that's a good question. I did think there was a high chance, but I think I follow the news closely enough to know that it wasn't a done deal until it was a done deal. And I wasn't going to make financial decisions until I saw that number in my online account actually go down. So I kind of held out a little bit, but it has a very real, tangible impact for a lot of people. And the Supreme Court keeps on wanting to rule by decree. For a court that claims not to be very activist, they're certainly making the biggest public policy changes of the decade out here, eliminating Roe v. Wade, ending affirmative action. So we'll see what happens. It's going to keep 2024 interesting.
Yeah, I just really feel for folks that maybe took it as a news headline and wasn't, maybe following as closely and decided to, you know what, I'm gonna hold off on paying my monthly minimums and who cares, right? Like I think there's a very, very bad wake up call coming for millions of Americans.
Yeah, it's true. Americans don't like having to suddenly pay $10,000 more.
I may not know America, but I know it this well. Yeah. Well, talking about, I guess, on the topic of giving, moving to the news that we sent out last week about the U.S. philanthropy dropping 17 billion, really coming from a drop in individual donors. And I'll just take a step back. This is coming from the Giving Institute. This is an annual Giving USA report on philanthropy, one that I really do look at as a bellwether of what's going on. Really good actual, data sorted and then turned into this report and broken down. But, that also means that the gross domestic product percentage, which, I come back to, it's always a little above 2%, always a little above 2%. Since like 1972, we go on the gold standard. You could look at whatever GDP is and say, like, give me 2% of the number and I'll show you giving. And this is in recent memory, 1.9% now is the percent of gross domestic product to charitable giving, which is a little alarming. And it's even worse. Maybe we can talk about like the inflation effects as well. This is just raw dollars I'm talking about. When you add in inflation, it gets even messier.
Yeah, George, I think that's exactly right. And just to read out some of the numbers again. So charitable giving in the United States experienced a decline in 2022. Donations dropped to $499 billion, which is down 3.4% from 2021 and 10.5% after you adjust for inflation, as reported by the nonprofit Times. And the Giving USA Foundation's report attributes this increase to inflation, economic uncertainty, and a decline in individual donors, which is what's most concerning. So individual donations declined 6.4% from 2021, representing 64% of overall giving, and foundation giving increased by 2.5%, representing 21% of all giving. So you had a significant decrease in individual donors and a little increase in institutional foundation giving, but that did not account for the overall decline in individual donations. So, of course, the report also says that religion and religious affiliated organizations topped the list in terms of total donation revenue at $143.5 billion. But George, taking a step back, you talk about the macroeconomic complications of the economy, but charitable giving dropping to those levels against GDP for the first time in recent memory. How should nonprofits, nonprofit fundraisers, nonprofit communications professionals be thinking about this decline? And how do we essentially rebuild donor urgency, donor trust, and activation to calls to action, especially now that this year is an off year on political cycle and we see donations kind of ramp up with political giving as social issues come to the forefront. But that's not this year. That's not until next year. For this year, how should nonprofit communications, fundraising, development, and other folks think about these numbers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think this is a tale of the long tail issue. There's a lot of people pointing to the fact that there's been maybe strategic shifts in the way that nonprofits have messaged small, mid-sized donors in a strategic way, rather preferring toward the high net worth, curation of a donor pool. And on a whole, yes, like one thought might be, how are we bringing up and nurturing in an efficient way, frankly, those small mid donors a bit more? And it's also kind of tough because it's not equally distributed. I think you get misled by, it's down like 3.4% or 10% after inflation. What I actually was more curious about is like which area, human services, education, health, international affairs, and actually was public society benefits. That categorization, representing 9% of the total pie of overall giving, that actually dropped by 15%. So public society benefit nonprofits had and saw 15% decline. After just in the 2020 to 2021, they saw a rise of 11.8%. So I think this is a sort of post-COVID rebalancing, unfortunately, in addition to a scarcity mindset of the long tail donor that really was the dominant narrative last year, with the markets declining, interest rates doing what they did, and money getting squeezed out of the system. So those pieces combined, I think, is that perfect storm that brings us below that 2% of GDP giving ratio. You need these like very, you know, unfortunate series of events to occur to push that number where it went to. I'm hoping that there's, a strong rebound, frankly, in the market, in the mindset, more importantly. And so maybe that's able to shift this year. But, anecdotally, a lot of trends, things we've seen is this year started where last year left off, which was tentative at best.
No, George, I think that's a good analysis. I would think that this year would hopefully be a little bit better as the economy adjusts to inflation, war, and other long-term economic challenges. I think consumer confidence is on the rise, so that's a good sign. Inflation is being contained, which is also a good sign. So maybe some signs for cautious optimism moving into the next 2 quarters. But we'll definitely keep an eye on this, and I'll be certainly interested to hear about the numbers for this year once it ends.
Yeah, I'm just following on what nonprofits can do. I mean, the amount of second order injustice being created by the Supreme Court justices will give a lot of messaging opportunities, and frankly, a lot of work that's going to need to be done. In the same way we saw massive inflows to groups like Planned Parenthood and affiliates last year in and around the Roe v. Wade, and continues because of the state by state ridiculousness going on. I think we're going to end up in a very similar case where, when you have work for nonprofits to do, it gives you really ready-made, top of mind. And that's what I really look for. Top of mind opportunity to message to donors, answering the key question of why now? And that becomes abundantly clear when you can tie it to current events. The takeaway is long, mid donors communicating around the why now along current events.
Absolutely. Although maybe it's a good thing we haven't had any earth-shattering global events this year. We've kind of kept those.
Oh God, we're only halfway through. What are you doing? All right. In other types of news, there is a really interesting nonprofit consultant survey, and we're going to be covering more about this in the future from nonprofitists and partners. And so if you're ever wondering how much you should be paying for different types of services, or I found more interesting how years of experience of a consultant in the field actually directly correlated to the hourly rate. Very interesting stuff. And that's all available at nonprofitist.com/consultant survey, also in our email. And we'll probably cover it in the future. Nick, did I remember a feel good story? I think I have a feel good story. I didn't share it with you, so I get to cover it. How about that? Get the response.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, where did I put this thing? Okay. So I have from ABC Action News, Tampa Bay, nonprofit Forest Blue teaches Gold Star children about ocean conservancy, and it's a really, great way of getting young people out there in the water, and is a nonprofit that retains special operations veterans to work with scientific partners. And the mission is conservation all around Florida, and it includes school for kids at Vortex Springs in Florida's Panhandle. And it's interesting too, because the children all have a parent who actually have either died or seriously injured while serving in the military. So great combination of causes right there.
That's awesome. That's a win-win-win. Getting those seafaring legs on early for the kids. No, but we love ocean conservation here at Wholewell. Of course, from our namesake, we love whales, we love oceans, we love water, and all of the above. So we love to hear that.
I feel like this is a recycling joke, but I never said it on this podcast, so I can use it. Why did the bike-a-thon participants fail to raise their target amount of money?
Why?
Well, it's a bike-a-thon, so they were too tired.
Oh,
Bikes have two
God.
tires, and so they're too tired. See, it's the quality I look for. Really, it's the quality. Well,
Is that
guess
what
we
it
get to
is?
make it to the end. So, thanks for telling me. This week on Bad Dad Jokes Explained for Nonprofits. You're welcome. All right. See ya.
Thanks, George.